3 years ago, I watched my younger brother accept a $2 million investment check on live television for an invention I created in my garage. He stood there in his designer suit, shaking hands with Silicon Valley investors, talking about his revolutionary water-saving technology that would change agriculture forever. The worst part wasn't seeing him get rich off my work. It was watching him look directly into the camera and say, "This innovation has been my passion project for the past 4 years." 4 years. I had been working on that exact technology for 4 years. He had known about it for exactly 6 months. But here's what David didn't know when he filed that patent application with his name as the sole inventor. I'm an engineer, and engineers document everything. Every failed prototype, every breakthrough moment, every late-night calculation that led to the final design. While he was busy charming investors and giving interviews about his brilliant innovation, I was quietly building the most comprehensive paper trail of intellectual property theft you've ever seen. Last month, David's company collapsed overnight. His investors pulled out, his board fired him, and the patent office didn't just reject his application, they referred his case to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. Because sometimes, the little sister who everyone underestimated turns out to be the one who knows exactly how to fight back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Martinez, and I've spent most of my 34 years trying to solve problems that other people don't even notice. Growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, you learn pretty quickly that water isn't something you can take for granted. While my friends were inside playing video games during those blazing summer months, I was in our backyard trying to figure out why our vegetable garden looked like a desert graveyard by July. My mom would stand at the kitchen window, watching me move sprinklers around, adjusting timers, measuring soil moisture with a makeshift gauge I'd built from electronics salvaged from old radios. She'd shake her head and say, "Mija, why don't you just plant cactus like everyone else?" But I couldn't let it go. There had to be a way to keep plants alive in the desert without drowning them in water we couldn't afford to waste. That obsession followed me through high school, where I was the kid who actually enjoyed physics class, through my mechanical engineering degree at Arizona State, and into my career at Henderson Engineering, a small firm that specialized in HVAC systems for commercial buildings. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and gave me the technical foundation I needed for what I was really passionate about. Every evening after work, I'd drive home to my small house in Tempe, change out of my work clothes, and head straight to my garage workshop. What started as a hobby had evolved into something much more serious. I had workbenches lined with sensors, microcontrollers, and irrigation components. My neighbors probably thought I was building bombs, but I was actually building the future of water conservation. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night in October, 3 years ago. I'd been struggling with a problem that had stumped me for months. How do you create an irrigation system that's smart enough to know exactly how much water each plant needs, when it needs it, and how to adjust for weather conditions that change by the hour in the desert? Traditional systems were either too simple, flooding plants with water on a basic timer, or too complicated for average homeowners to install and maintain. I was sitting on my garage floor at 11 p.m., surrounded by circuit boards and soil moisture sensors, when it hit me. The problem wasn't the hardware, it was the software. Instead of trying to predict what plants needed, I could create a system that learned from the plants themselves. Soil moisture sensors would provide real-time data, weather APIs would supply precipitation forecasts, and machine learning algorithms would adjust watering schedules based on actual plant response rather than theoretical models. I spent the next 6 months teaching myself programming languages I'd never used before, writing algorithms that could process multiple data streams simultaneously, and testing sensor configurations that could withstand Arizona's extreme temperatures. My garage became a laboratory where I ran controlled experiments, comparing plant health and water usage across different irrigation strategies. The results were better than I'd dared to hope. My prototype system reduced water usage by 63% compared to traditional sprinkler systems, while actually improving plant health. The tomatoes in my test garden were bigger and more abundant than anything my neighbors were growing, with conventional methods. My water bill dropped from $140 a month to $52, and that was during the hottest summer on record. But the real validation came from my engineering notebooks. I've always been meticulous about documentation, a habit drilled into me during my engineering studies and reinforced by years of working on projects where precision mattered. Every design iteration was photographed and dated. Every test result was recorded with detailed notes about environmental conditions, sensor readings, and plant responses. Every breakthrough moment was captured with timestamps and technical explanations that could be understood by other engineers. I filled 4 composition notebooks over 3 years, creating a detailed timeline of innovation that traced every step from initial concept to working prototype. Looking back, I realized this obsessive documentation would become the most important work I'd ever done, though at the time it just felt like good engineering practice. My younger brother, David, had always been different from me. Where I was methodical and detail-oriented, he was spontaneous and charismatic. While I spent hours in my garage tinkering with sensors and algorithms, he was out networking at business meetups, talking about entrepreneurship and disruption and all the buzzwords that seem to open doors in the startup world. David had graduated from Arizona State with an MBA 2 years after I finished my engineering degree. He'd worked briefly at a few marketing firms and tech companies, always talking about launching his own business, but never quite finding the right opportunity. He was the kind of person who could walk into any room and immediately identify the most important person there, then charm his way into a conversation that somehow always ended with exchanged business cards and promises to connect soon. Our family had always celebrated David's social skills while treating my technical abilities as a given. At family gatherings, relatives would ask David about his latest business venture, his networking events, his plans for entrepreneurial success. When they talked to me, it was usually about whether I'd found a boyfriend yet, or when I was planning to use my engineering degree to find a more stable corporate job. I didn't resent the attention David received. We'd always been close, despite our different personalities. He'd helped me move into my first apartment after college. I'd helped him study for the quantitative sections of his GMAT. We had the kind of sibling relationship where our differences complemented each other rather than creating rivalry. That's why I was so excited when David showed genuine interest in my irrigation project. It was during our monthly family barbecue at our parents' house, a Sunday afternoon tradition that brought together aunts, uncles, cousins, and whoever else happened to be in town. I'd been telling our cousin Maria about the water savings I'd achieved with my smart irrigation system when David overheard and came over to join the conversation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah, are you serious about these numbers? 60% water reduction? David asked, leaning forward with the kind of focused attention I'd rarely seen him give to technical subjects. I pulled out my phone and showed him photos of my garden, side-by-side comparisons of plant health, and screenshots of my water bills. David's eyes lit up in a way I'd never seen before. "This is incredible," he said. "Do you realize what this could mean for California agriculture? For golf courses? In Nevada? For anyone trying to maintain landscaping in drought conditions?" I felt a surge of excitement. Finally, someone who understood the potential impact of what I'd been working on. David asked detailed questions about the technology, the cost of components, the complexity of installation. He wanted to know about market size, potential customers, scalability challenges. "Sarah, you could make millions with this. You need to patent this technology immediately and start building a business around it." The thought of turning my garage project into a real company was thrilling and terrifying. I knew how to build irrigation systems, but I'd never filed a patent application, never pitched to investors, never navigated the legal and regulatory challenges of bringing a new product to market. "I'd love to help you with the business side," David continued. "This could be exactly what I've been looking for. You focus on perfecting the technology, and I'll handle everything else. We could be partners." The idea of partnering with David felt perfect. He had the business skills I lacked, the confidence to pitch to investors, the network of contacts who could open doors I didn't even know existed. Together, we could take my innovation from a garage workshop to a company that could actually make a difference in how people use water. "Let me handle the business filings while you keep working on the engineering," David offered. "I'll set up the LLC, get the patent process started, maybe even start reaching out to potential investors. You just focus on what you do best." Was so grateful for his offer. Engineering had always been my strength, but the business development side felt overwhelming. Having David handle the corporate infrastructure while I refined the technology seemed like the ideal division of labor. We shook hands in my parents' backyard, sealing what I thought was the beginning of a true partnership. David would incorporate the business, file the necessary legal paperwork, and start building relationships with potential investors. I would continue developing the technology, improving the algorithms, and preparing for the manufacturing challenges we'd face when scaling production. Over the next few months, David gave me regular updates on his progress. He'd registered the business name Martin Tech Solutions, combining our family name with his vision for a technology company. He was working with lawyers to file patent applications and had started reaching out to his network about potential investment opportunities. Meanwhile, I continued refining my irrigation system. I built more sophisticated prototypes, tested different sensor configurations, and improved the machine learning algorithms that made the system increasingly intelligent. My engineering notebooks filled with detailed documentation of each improvement, every bug fix, every performance optimization. I trusted David completely to handle the business side while I focused on making the technology as robust and scalable as possible. We were siblings, partners, and collaborators working toward a shared vision of revolutionizing water conservation. I never imagined that trust would become the foundation of the most painful betrayal I'd ever experienced. Looking back now, I can see warning signs I missed at the time. David's reluctance to show me the patent application drafts he was supposedly working on. His vague answers when I asked about the specific investors he was talking to. The way he'd change the subject whenever I wanted to discuss the legal structure of our partnership. But at the time, I was so focused on perfecting my technology that I didn't question his handling of the business details. I was grateful to have someone I trusted managing the aspects of company building that felt foreign and overwhelming to me. I had no idea that while I was documenting every technical improvement in my meticulous engineering notebooks, David was preparing to cut me out of the business entirely. I didn't know that the patent application he was filing would list him as the sole inventor of technology I'd spent 3 years developing. I couldn't have imagined that my own brother was planning to present my life's work as his own innovation. The trust I placed in David during those months would soon become the most expensive mistake I'd ever made. But it would also become the foundation for the most important lesson I'd ever learn about protecting intellectual property, documenting innovation, and never assuming that family loyalty will protect you from business betrayal. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would destroy our relationship, threaten David's freedom, and ultimately teach both of us that in the world of patents and intellectual property, blood relations matter far less than legal documentation. And fortunately for me, I had more documentation than David could have possibly imagined. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Wednesday morning in March. I was sitting in my cubicle at Henderson Engineering, reviewing HVAC specifications for a new office complex, when my phone buzzed with a news alert from TechCrunch. I almost dismissed it, but the headline caught my attention. Phoenix startup Martin Tech Solutions raises $2, 3M Series A for revolutionary water conservation technology. My heart stopped. Martin Tech Solutions. That was the company name David had registered for our partnership. But this article was talking about a Series A funding round, something we'd never discussed. I clicked the link with trembling fingers, and what I saw made me feel physically sick. There was David, standing in what looked like a professional conference room, wearing an expensive navy suit I'd never seen before. He was holding up my irrigation controller, the exact prototype I'd built in my garage, the one with the blue, housing and the specific sensor configuration I'd spent months perfecting. Behind him was a banner with the Martin Tech Solutions logo and the tagline, "Smart Water, Smarter Future." I read the article with growing horror. CEO David Martinez demonstrates the innovative irrigation technology his team has developed over the past 2 years. His team. 2 years. I'd been working on this technology for 3 years, and David had known about it for exactly 8 months. The article quoted David extensively. "Water scarcity is one of the defining challenges of our generation," he said. "Our proprietary irrigation system uses advanced machine learning algorithms and IoT sensors to optimize water usage while improving plant health. We've achieved up to 65% water reduction in our pilot programs." 65%. That was my number, rounded up from the 63% I'd actually achieved. But what made it worse was reading about our proprietary algorithms and our innovative sensor array and our breakthrough in agricultural technology. Every technical detail mentioned in the article came directly from my work, my research, my 3 years of development. The investors quoted in the article talked about David's visionary leadership and his deep understanding of both the technical and market challenges in water conservation. One venture capitalist said, "David has built something truly revolutionary." His background in both engineering and business gives him a unique perspective on solving complex environmental problems. Background in engineering. David had never taken an engineering course in his life. His degree was in business administration, and his work experience was entirely in marketing and sales. Yet here he was being celebrated as a technical innovator, while I wasn't mentioned anywhere in the article. I tried calling David immediately, but my calls went straight to voicemail. I sent him a text message. "David, I just saw the TechCrunch article. We need to talk right now." No response. I sent another message. "This isn't what we agreed on. You said we were partners." Still nothing. By lunchtime, I couldn't concentrate on work. I told my supervisor I felt sick and needed to go home. Early, which wasn't entirely untrue. I drove to David's apartment complex, but his car wasn't in the parking lot. I called our mom to see if she'd heard from him, but she just said he'd mentioned being busy with some big business opportunity. It wasn't until Thursday evening that David finally called me back. His voice was different, more formal and distant than usual. "Sarah, I saw your messages. I understand you're surprised by the news coverage, but let me explain what's happening." Surprised? I could barely control my anger. "David, that article makes it sound like you invented my irrigation system. They're calling you the CEO of a company I thought we were building together." "Look, Sarah, the situation evolved faster than I expected. When I started talking to investors about the technology, they wanted to see a clear ownership structure and strong leadership team. These are sophisticated investors who need to understand exactly who's responsible for what. And you told them you were responsible for the technology I spent 3 years developing?" David sighed, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. "I told them I was leading the technical development team. Sarah, you have to understand how this works. Investors don't want to hear about complicated partnership structures or shared credit. They want to see one person who's clearly in charge and accountable for results." "But it's my invention, David. I created every component of that system. I wrote the algorithms, I designed the sensor configurations, I ran all the tests." "And that was great foundational work," David said. his tone becoming more condescending. But taking a garage project to market requires a completely different skill set. I've been doing the real work of building a business, talking to investors, developing go-to-market strategies, building partnerships. The engineering was just the starting point. I felt like he'd slapped me across the face. 3 years of nights and weekends, hundreds of hours of research and development, breakthrough innovations that solved problems no one else had figured out, and he called it foundational work and the starting point. David, I need to see the patent application. I need to understand what legal documents you've filed and how my work is being represented. Sarah, you're getting worked up over nothing. The patents will protect the technology regardless of whose name is on them. When the company succeeds, we'll both benefit financially. Isn't that what matters? Whose name is on the patents, David? The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, David spoke, and his voice was different again, harder. Sarah, you need to understand something. I've invested 8 months of my life building this company. I've pitched to dozens of investors, dealt with lawyers, handled all the business development that you couldn't or wouldn't do. The patent applications list me as the primary inventor, because I'm the one who turned your garage hobby into a viable commercial product. Primary inventor. Not sole inventor, but primary inventor, which somehow made it worse. It meant David acknowledged my contribution, but had legally minimized it to something secondary, something less important than his business development. Work. I want to see the patent application, David. Today. That's not possible. The applications are confidential during the review process, and they're filed under the company's intellectual property, which I'm legally responsible for protecting. I realized then that David had been planning this for months. He hadn't just stumbled into claiming credit for my work. He'd systematically positioned himself as the inventor while relegating me to some kind of technical assistant role. The company registration, the patent applications, the investor presentations had all been designed to establish him as the creator of technology I'd developed years before he'd even known it existed. David, I have 3 years of documentation showing the development of this technology. I have photographs, test results, engineering notebooks that prove I created this system long before you were involved. Sarah, I appreciate your contributions. I really do. But documentation of preliminary research isn't the same as building a commercial product. What I've created is a scalable business that can actually make a difference in the world. What he'd created, not what we'd created together, not what I'd invented and he'd commercialized, but what he'd created. In David's mind, taking my invention and raising money for it had somehow transformed him into the creator of the technology itself. The conversation ended with David promising we'd work out the details once the funding was finalized and the company was established. He assured me there would be a place for me in the engineering team, reporting to the CTO he was planning to hire, reporting to someone else to work on technology I'd invented. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the TechCrunch article, about David's confident presentation of my work as his innovation, about the investors who believed they were funding a visionary entrepreneur rather than someone who'd stolen his sister's invention. But more than anger, I felt a profound sense of betrayal. This wasn't just about money or credit or business success. David had taken something deeply personal to me, something I'd poured my passion into for years, and claimed it as his own achievement. He'd erased my contribution not just from legal documents, but from the public narrative about how this technology came to exist. The worst part was realizing that David genuinely seemed to believe his own story. In his mind, the business development work he'd done over 8 months somehow outweighed the 3 years I'd spent creating the actual technology. He'd convinced himself that raising money and filing paperwork made him the true creator of an invention he'd had nothing to do with developing. I spent the weekend reading everything I could find about patent law, intellectual property rights, and inventor fraud. What I learned was both encouraging and terrifying. The good news was that prior art, evidence that an invention existed before, a patent application was filed, could be used to challenge fraudulent patents. The bad news was that patent disputes were expensive, time-consuming, and often came down to whose documentation was more convincing. Fortunately for me, I had documentation David couldn't have imagined. My engineering notebooks weren't just casual notes about a hobby project. They were detailed technical records that could prove not just that I'd invented the technology first, but that I'd invented it years before David had filed his patent application. The question was whether I had the courage to use that documentation to destroy my brother's business and possibly send him to prison for patent fraud, because that's what I was contemplating. Not just getting credit for my invention, but exposing David as a fraud and a thief. Part 3. The crushing blow. The following Monday brought news that made everything worse. I was checking LinkedIn during my lunch break when I saw that David had updated his profile. His new title read, CEO and Founder, Martin Tech Solutions. The summary section described him as a technology entrepreneur with deep expertise in water conservation and agricultural innovation. His experience section now listed principal engineer and inventor as his role at Martin Tech, with bullet points describing development of proprietary irrigation algorithms and breakthrough innovations in sensor technology. Principal, engineer, and inventor. David had never written a line of code in his life, had never designed a circuit, had never run a controlled experiment on plant irrigation. Yet his professional profile now presented him as the technical mastermind behind innovations I'd spent years developing. But the profile also contained something that would later become crucial evidence. Under his education section, David had added a line about self-directed study in mechanical engineering and agricultural technology. Self-directed study. He was trying to create a paper trail that would support his claim of technical expertise, but what he'd actually done was document his lack of formal engineering training. That same day, I received a LinkedIn message from Jake Thompson, a technology journalist who wrote for several industry publications. Hi, Sarah. I'm researching a story about water conservation startups in the Southwest. Your name came up in some engineering forums as someone with expertise in this area. Would you be available for a brief interview about trends in agricultural technology? I stared at the message for a long time. Jake Thompson had written the TechCrunch article about David's funding round, though I didn't think he knew about my connection to Martin Tech. This felt like an opportunity to tell my side of the story, but I wasn't sure I was ready for that conversation. Instead of responding immediately, I spent the evening researching Jake's background and reading his previous articles. He seemed to be a legitimate journalist who focused on technology startups and innovation stories. His writing was generally fair and well-researched, and he had a reputation for asking tough questions when something didn't add up. I decided to respond, but carefully. Hi, Jake. Thanks for reaching out. I'd be happy to discuss water conservation technology in general terms. Are you available for a phone call this week? We scheduled a call for Wednesday evening. Jake started with broad questions about the challenges of agriculture in arid climates and the potential for technology solutions to address water scarcity. But gradually, his questions became more specific. I've been looking into some of the newer companies in this space, Jake said. Have you heard of Martin Tech Solutions? They seem to have developed some interesting irrigation technology. My heart rate increased, but I tried to keep my voice neutral. Yes, I've seen some coverage of their work. What specifically interests you about their approach? Well, I wrote about their recent funding round, but I've been trying to verify some of the technical claims in their investor materials. The CEO, David Martinez, claims to have developed proprietary machine learning algorithms for irrigation optimization, but I can't find any academic papers or prior work that supports his technical background. This was the moment I'd been both hoping for and dreading. Jake had noticed the same inconsistencies that were obvious to anyone who looked closely at David's claims. I could either maintain my silence and let David continue perpetrating fraud, or I could tell the truth and potentially destroy my brother's life. "Jake, this is a complicated situation," I said finally. "I'm not sure I'm the right person to comment on Martin Tech specifically." "I understand if there are confidentiality concerns," Jake replied. "But I'm getting the sense that there might be more to this story than what's in the public record. If there are questions about the legitimacy of their technical claims, that's something investors and customers need to know." Jake was giving me an opening to expose David without directly accusing him of fraud, but I wasn't ready to take that step. Not yet. "Let me think about this," I told Jake. "There are some personal considerations I need to work through before I can discuss this further." "Of course," Jake said. "But Sarah, if you have information that suggests investors are being misled about the origins of this technology, that's a serious matter. People are making financial decisions based on claims that might not be accurate." After ending the call, I realized I was at a crossroads. I could continue hoping that David would somehow make things right, that he'd find a way to give me appropriate credit and include me in the business we'd originally planned to build together. Or I could accept that David had no intention of sharing credit for my work and start taking steps to protect my intellectual property. The decision was made for me the next day when I received an email from a patent attorney named Michael Chen. The subject line read, "Informal Patent Inquiry, Martin Tech Solutions." The email explained that Michael represented a client who was considering a licensing deal with Martin Tech, but had questions about the validity of their patent applications. He'd found my name in engineering forums discussing water conservation, technology, and wondered if I could provide any insights about the technical claims in Martin Tech's patents. Michael was careful not to make any direct accusations, but his questions were pointed. He wanted to know if I was aware of any prior art that might affect Martin Tech's patent applications. He asked about the timeline of various technological developments in smart irrigation systems. Most significantly, he asked if I knew of any other inventors who might have legitimate claims to the technology Martin Tech was trying to patent. I realized that David's fraud was about to be exposed whether I participated or not. Other people in the industry were starting to ask questions about the legitimacy of his technical claims. If I remained silent, David might still face serious consequences, but I'd lose any chance to reclaim credit for my own work. I called Michael Chen and asked if we could meet in person to discuss the situation confidentially. We arranged to meet that Saturday at a coffee shop in Scottsdale, far enough from both my workplace and David's usual haunts that we were unlikely to be seen together. Michael turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 50s who specialized in intellectual property disputes. He explained that his client, a major irrigation equipment manufacturer, was conducting due diligence on Martin Tech before entering into a licensing agreement. Their technical team had reviewed Martin Tech's patent applications and found several inconsistencies that raised red flags. The patents describe sophisticated algorithms and sensor configurations that would have taken years to develop, Michael explained. But David Martinez has no documented history of working in this field before founding Martin Tech. His previous employment was entirely in marketing and business development. Michael showed me printed copies of David's patent applications. Seeing my own work described in legal language, with David listed as the sole inventor, was devastating. Every technical innovation I'd developed was there, described with the precision of someone who truly understood the technology. But David's name was on every page as the creator of inventions I'd spent 3 years developing. "Sarah, I need to ask you directly," Michael said. "Do you have any knowledge of prior art that would invalidate these patent applications?" I took a deep breath and made the decision that would change everything. "Michael, I am the prior art. I invented this technology 3 years ago, and I have extensive documentation to prove it." I spent the next 2 hours telling Michael everything: the 3 years of development work, the detailed engineering notebooks, the photographs of prototypes, the test results showing gradual improvements in efficiency. I explained how David had offered to help with business development, how I'd trusted him to handle patent applications and investor relations, how I'd discovered his betrayal through a TechCrunch article. Michael listened carefully, taking detailed notes and asking specific questions about dates, documentation, and the technical development process. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, what you're describing is one of the clearest cases of inventor fraud I've ever encountered. If your documentation is as comprehensive as you've described, David's patent applications aren't just invalid, they're criminally fraudulent." Michael explained that patent fraud was a federal crime that could result in significant fines and prison time. He also explained that the Patent Office took inventor fraud very seriously, especially in cases where fraudulent patents were being used to raise investment capital. "But I need to warn you," Michael continued. "Pursuing this will almost certainly destroy your relationship with your brother permanently. Patent fraud cases get public attention, especially when they involve startup companies that have raised significant funding. David won't just lose his patents, he could face criminal charges." I thought about David, about our childhood together, about the family barbecues where we'd laughed and planned our business partnership. I thought about our parents, who would be devastated to learn that their son was a fraud and a thief. I thought about the investors who'd trusted David with their money based on technology he'd stolen from his sister. "Michael, I need some time to think about this, but I want to know what my options are if I decide to move forward." Michael outlined the process. First, I would need to file a formal challenge to David's patent applications with the Patent Office, providing evidence of prior art that predated his filings. Simultaneously, I could file my own patent applications as the true inventor of the technology. If the evidence was compelling, the Patent Office would likely suspend David's applications and investigate the fraud allegations. "The key will be your documentation," Michael said. "Patent disputes often come down to who can prove they invented something first. If your engineering notebooks are as detailed as you've described, they could provide the timeline evidence we need to demonstrate fraud." I left the coffee shop with Michael's business card and a decision to make. I could continue trying to work things out with David privately, hoping he'd eventually do the right thing and give me appropriate credit. Or I could use the legal system to reclaim my intellectual property and expose David as a fraud. The decision became easier when I got home and found a voicemail from David. His tone was casual, friendly, as if nothing had changed between us. "Hey Sarah, hope you're doing well. I wanted to let you know that we're making great progress with Martin Tech. The investor funding came through, and we're starting to hire our technical team. I think there could be a position for you as a senior engineer once things get more established. It would be great to have your expertise on the team. Give me a call back when you get a chance." A position for me as a senior engineer, working on technology I'd invented for a company built on patents, filed under my brother's name, reporting to executives who believed David was the technical genius behind the innovation. That night, I made photocopies of my most important engineering notebooks and began organizing 3 years of documentation into a comprehensive timeline of invention. If David wanted to play legal games with my intellectual property, I was prepared to show him that engineers keep better records than business majors. The war for my invention was about to begin, and David had no idea how well armed I was for the battle ahead. Part 4. The Dark Moment and Awakening. The next 2 weeks were the darkest period of my professional life. I went through the motions at Henderson Engineering, reviewing HVAC specifications and attending project meetings, but my mind was constantly focused on the betrayal I was processing. Every time I looked at the irrigation system in my backyard, I was reminded that my own brother had stolen years of my work and was being celebrated as an innovative entrepreneur. The worst part wasn't even the theft itself. It was the way David had managed to convince himself, and everyone around him, that his version of events was legitimate. I watched him post updates on LinkedIn about building breakthrough technology, and leading innovation in water conservation. He shared articles about Martin Tech with commentary about the incredible journey of bringing his vision to market. His vision. Technology I'd developed was now being described as David's vision. His breakthrough, his innovation. He'd rewritten history so completely that I began to question my own memories. Had I somehow misunderstood our partnership agreement? Was I being unreasonable to expect credit for work David claimed to have transformed into a viable business? These doubts lasted until I opened my engineering notebooks and saw 3 years of detailed documentation in my own handwriting. Page after page of technical drawings, test results, algorithm improvements, and breakthrough moments that had nothing to do with David and everything to do with late nights in my garage workshop. The documentation told a clear story. In October, 3 years ago, I'd written Breakthrough in Sensor Calibration, achieved 61% water reduction in test garden. In December, I'd noted Algorithm Optimization Complete, now achieving 63% efficiency improvement. In March of the following year, I'd documented Prototype ready for extended field testing, all systems performing within specifications. David had known about my work for 8 months. His patent applications claimed he'd been developing the technology for 2 years. But my notebooks proved I'd been working on irrigation optimization for 3 years, achieving the exact performance. Metrics David was now claiming as his own innovations. Looking through my documentation, I realized David had made a crucial mistake. He'd based his patent applications on my final prototype, but he'd had no access to the years of development, work that led to that design. His applications described the end result of my research without understanding the underlying principles that made the technology work. This meant David's patents were not just fraudulent, they were technically incomplete. Anyone trying to replicate the system based on his patent descriptions would likely fail, because David didn't truly understand the engineering principles behind the technology he was claiming to have invented. I began to see David's fraud not just as a personal betrayal, but as a technical impossibility. You can't patent an invention you don't understand, and David's applications proved he didn't understand the technology he was trying to claim. The realization gave me something I'd been lacking since discovering David's betrayal: confidence. I wasn't just a victim of fraud, I was an engineer with superior documentation, deeper technical knowledge, and legal rights that David couldn't simply wish away with charismatic investor presentations. That Saturday, I drove to the Arizona State University Library and spent the day researching patent law, intellectual property disputes, and inventor fraud cases. What I learned was both encouraging and sobering. The patent system was designed to protect true inventors, but challenging fraudulent patents required extensive documentation and often lengthy legal proceedings. However, I also learned about something called prior art, which could be used to invalidate patents that claimed to invent technology that already existed. My engineering notebooks represented exactly the kind of prior art that could destroy David's patent applications, especially since they predated his filings by more than 2 years. More importantly, I learned that inventor fraud was a federal crime with serious consequences. If David had knowingly filed false information with the patent office, claiming to be the inventor of technology he'd stolen, he could face criminal charges, significant fines, and potential prison time. The legal research also revealed something that made David's fraud even more serious. He'd used his fraudulent patent applications as the basis for raising investment capital. This meant his fraud hadn't just harmed me. It had potentially defrauded investors who'd provided funding based on intellectual property David didn't actually own. On Sunday evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Michael Chen, the patent attorney I'd met the previous week. Michael, I've been thinking about our conversation, and I've decided I want to move forward with challenging David's patent applications. I have the documentation to prove prior art, and I think it's time to reclaim my intellectual property. Michael was pleased but cautious. Sarah, I want to make sure you understand what you're committing to. Patent disputes can be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. You'll be challenging not just David's patents, but his entire business, his reputation, and his relationship with investors. I understand, I replied, but David made this choice when he decided to steal my work. I'm not going to let him build a career on technology he had nothing to do with developing. Michael outlined the next steps. First, we would need to organize my documentation into a comprehensive prior art submission for the Patent Office. This would include my engineering notebooks, photographs of prototypes, test results, and any other evidence that could establish a timeline of invention, predating David's patent applications. Simultaneously, we would prepare my own patent applications as the true inventor of the technology. Since I had documentation proving I'd invented the technology years before David's applications, my patents would likely be approved, while his were rejected. The key will be demonstrating not just that you invented the technology first, but that David knew about your work when he filed his applications, Michael explained. If we can prove he knowingly submitted false information to the Patent Office, this becomes a criminal matter rather than just a civil dispute. I realized I had exactly the evidence Michael was describing. Text messages between David and me discussing the technology. Family members who could testify that David had learned about my work at our barbecue. Email exchanges where David had offered to help with patent applications for technology he later claimed to have invented himself. Michael, David didn't just steal my technology. He documented the theft in text messages and emails. I can prove he knew this was my invention when he filed his patent applications. Michael was quiet for a moment. Sarah, if that's true, then David didn't just commit patent fraud. He committed a very well-documented patent fraud that will be easy to prosecute. We scheduled a meeting for the following Wednesday to begin organizing my documentation and preparing the formal challenge to David's patents. Michael warned me that once we filed the paperwork, there would be no going back. David would learn about the challenge, and our family relationship would likely be destroyed permanently. Are you prepared for that outcome? Michael asked. I thought about David's LinkedIn posts celebrating his success with my technology. I thought about the investors who believed they were funding an innovative entrepreneur rather than a thief. I thought about the 3 years I'd spent developing technology that was now making someone else rich and famous. Michael, my relationship with David was destroyed the moment he decided to steal my work and claim it as his own innovation. Filing legal papers won't destroy our relationship. It will just make the destruction official. That night, I began the painstaking process of organizing 3 years of engineering documentation into a timeline that would prove my case. Each notebook entry was photographed and dated. Each prototype image was cataloged with technical specifications. Each test result was organized chronologically to show the gradual development of increasingly sophisticated technology. As I worked, I realized that my obsessive documentation habits had created something more valuable than any business degree or investor presentation. I had created an unassailable legal record of innovation that David couldn't challenge, couldn't dismiss, and couldn't explain away. David had always been the charismatic one, the one who could charm investors and build business relationships. But charm couldn't overcome engineering documentation, and charisma wouldn't protect him from federal fraud charges. For the first time since discovering David's betrayal, I felt something other than anger and hurt. I felt powerful, not because I wanted to destroy my brother, but because I finally understood that I had the tools and evidence necessary to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The quiet engineer who'd spent 3 years documenting every detail of her innovation was about to teach the charismatic entrepreneur that technical precision beats business charm when the stakes involve federal law and intellectual property rights. Part 5. The Hidden Advantage and Strategic Response. My meeting with Michael Chen on Wednesday changed everything about how I viewed my situation. What I'd initially seen as a personal betrayal, Michael helped me understand as a federal eye. crime with far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond family drama. We spent 3 hours in his office going through my documentation systematically. Michael examined each engineering notebook with the precision of someone who'd spent decades evaluating intellectual property disputes. He photographed key pages, noted critical dates, and asked detailed questions about my development process. Sarah, I've been practicing patent law for 23 years, and I've never seen documentation this comprehensive from an individual inventor, Michael said as he reviewed my third notebook. Most engineers keep basic notes, but you've created a forensic timeline that proves not just what you invented, but exactly when you invented it. Michael was particularly interested in my habit of dating and photographing every prototype iteration. My garage workshop had inadvertently become a legal evidence factory, with thousands of time-stamped images showing the gradual evolution of technology David was now claiming to have developed from scratch. This photograph from 18 months ago shows the exact sensor configuration that's described in David's patent application, Michael noted, pointing to an image of my early prototype. But according to his timeline, he hadn't started working on this technology yet. We discovered that David had made several critical errors in his patent applications that would make them easy to challenge. He'd claimed to have developed certain algorithms that I'd actually created 2 years before his supposed start date. He'd described sensor calibration techniques that took me months to perfect, but claimed to have developed them in a matter of weeks. Most damaging, David had included performance specifications in his patents that exactly matched the test results documented in my engineering notebooks. The 65% water reduction he claimed as his breakthrough achievement was based on the 63% efficiency I'd actually measured, rounded up to make his claims sound more impressive. He's not just claiming to have invented your technology, Michael observed. He's claiming to have achieved the exact same performance results you documented, which would be statistically impossible if he'd developed this independently. Michael also noticed something in David's patent applications that I'd missed. The technical language was sophisticated and precise, describing complex engineering concepts with the expertise of someone who truly understood the technology. But David's educational background was entirely in business, with no formal training in engineering or algorithm development. Either David has secret technical expertise that's not reflected in his professional background, Michael said, or someone with deep engineering knowledge wrote these patent applications for him. I realized that David had probably hired technical writers to translate my prototype into patent language, not understanding that the sophisticated technical descriptions would actually work against him by highlighting the gap between his claimed expertise and his actual qualifications. Michael, I think David hired consultants to write the patents based on my prototype, but he didn't understand that the technical sophistication would make his fraud more obvious, not less. That's exactly what happened, Michael agreed, and it's going to make our case much stronger. The patents describe technology with a level of technical detail that David couldn't possibly understand based on his background. Michael outlined our strategy for challenging David's patents. We would file a comprehensive prior art submission with the patent office, including my complete engineering documentation, photographs of prototypes, and test results that predated David's applications by more than 2 years. Simultaneously, we would file patent applications in my name as the true inventor of the technology. Since my documentation clearly established prior art, my patents would likely be approved while David's were rejected for being based on existing technology. But Michael also suggested something I hadn't considered: filing a formal complaint, with the Patent Office's investigative division alleging inventor fraud. If the Patent Office determined that David had knowingly submitted false information, they could refer the case to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. Sarah, this isn't just about getting your patents back, Michael explained. David used fraudulent intellectual property claims to raise investment capital. That makes this a case of investor fraud as well as patent fraud. The consequences for David could be severe. Michael asked if I was prepared for the possibility that David might face criminal charges. Patent fraud was a federal felony that could result in significant fines and prison time. Even if David avoided criminal prosecution, the exposure of his fraud would likely destroy his business and his reputation in the technology industry. "I don't want to destroy David's life," I told Michael, "but I can't let him build a career on technology he stole from me. If there are legal consequences for patent fraud, those are consequences David chose when he decided to commit fraud." Michael nodded approvingly. "That's the right attitude. You're not pursuing this to harm David. You're pursuing it to protect your intellectual property rights. Any consequences David faces are the result of his own choices." We scheduled follow-up meetings to organize the formal patent challenge and discuss the timeline for filing. Michael estimated that the patent office would likely suspend David's applications within 60 days of receiving our submission, especially given the strength of my prior art documentation. "But be prepared for David to fight back," Michael warned. "Once he learns about the patent challenge, he'll probably try to discredit you or claim that you stole the technology from him. Patent fraud cases can get ugly when the stakes are high." That evening, I began the process of organizing my documentation into the comprehensive legal submission Michael would file with the patent office. Every photograph was cataloged with technical explanations. Every notebook entry was transcribed and cross-referenced with development timelines. Every test result was formatted to clearly demonstrate the gradual evolution of increasingly sophisticated technology. As I worked, I discovered documentation I'd forgotten about that made David's fraud even more obvious. Email exchanges where David had asked technical questions that proved he didn't understand basic principles behind the technology he was claiming to have invented. Text messages where he'd thanked me for explaining engineering concepts that were fundamental to the irrigation system's operation. Most significantly, I found a voice message David had left me 6 months earlier, before he'd started claiming credit for my work. In the message, he'd said, "Sarah, I've been thinking about your irrigation system, and I really think you've created something revolutionary. I know I don't understand all the technical stuff, but I can see the business potential. Let me help you turn your invention into a real company." Your invention, David's own voice, recorded on my phone, acknowledging that the technology belonged to me. It was evidence that would be almost impossible for him to explain away in legal proceedings. I also realized that my documentation included something that would make David's fraud prosecution much easier. Proof that he'd known about my work when he filed his patent applications. Text messages discussing the technology, emails about business development plans, family members who could testify about David learning about my invention at our barbecue. David hadn't just committed patent fraud, he'd created a detailed record of his fraud that would make prosecution straightforward for federal investigators. By Thursday evening, I'd assembled a comprehensive legal case that included over 400 pages of documentation, 200 photographs of prototype development, and dozens of electronic communications that proved David's knowledge of my prior work. Looking at the organized evidence, I realized that David's biggest mistake hadn't been stealing my technology. His biggest mistake had been underestimating the quiet engineer who documented everything, kept detailed records, and understood that technical precision would always beat business charisma in legal proceedings. The shy sister who'd always been overshadowed by David's social skills was about to demonstrate that meticulous engineering documentation was more powerful than any investor presentation or media interview. David had gambled his freedom on the assumption that his quiet engineer sister wouldn't have the knowledge or courage to challenge him in federal court. He was about to learn that assumption would cost him everything. On Friday morning, I made the phone call that would change both our lives forever. Michael Chen answered on the second ring, and I could hear the determination in my own voice as I spoke. "Michael, I'm ready to file everything. The patent challenge, the fraud complaint, my own patent applications. All of it." "Are you absolutely certain, Sarah?" Once we submit these documents, there's no undoing this process. David will face serious legal consequences, and your family relationships will never be the same. I thought about the 3 years I'd spent perfecting technology that was now making David wealthy and famous. I thought about the investors who'd been deceived into funding a company based on stolen intellectual property. I thought about other engineers who might be watching to see whether patent fraud would be allowed to succeed. Michael, I've been certain since the moment I realized David had put his name on patents for technology I invented. File everything today. Michael's office became a flurry of activity as we prepared the most comprehensive patent fraud case he'd ever assembled. We organized my documentation into 3 separate legal submissions: a prior art challenge to David's existing patent, applications, new patent applications in my name as the true inventor, and a formal fraud complaint to the Patent Office's investigative division. The prior art submission alone was over 300 pages, including complete photocopies of my engineering notebooks, chronologically organized photographs of prototype development, and detailed technical analyses that proved my technology predated David's applications by more than 2 years. But the fraud complaint was even more damaging to David's case. We included the voice message where David had acknowledged the technology as your invention, text messages where he'd asked me to explain basic engineering concepts, and email, exchanges that proved he'd known about my prior work when he filed his patent applications. Sarah, this fraud complaint reads like a prosecutor's dream case, Michael observed as we reviewed the final documents. David didn't just steal your technology, he created a paper trail that documents every aspect of his theft. Michael explained that patent fraud investigations typically took months to complete, but our case was so well documented that the Patent Office would likely act quickly. The combination of clear prior art and obvious fraud allegations would probably result in immediate suspension of David's patent applications. The Patent Office takes fraud very seriously, especially when it involves startup companies raising investment capital, Michael said. If they determine that David knowingly filed false information, they'll refer the case to federal prosecutors within weeks. We spent the afternoon reviewing every document one final time, ensuring that dates were accurate, technical descriptions were precise, and legal arguments were bulletproof. By 4 p.m., we had assembled the most comprehensive patent fraud case in Michael's 23-year career. At 4:30 p.m. on Friday afternoon, Michael filed all 3 submissions electronically with the Patent Office. The prior art challenge, the fraud complaint, and my own patent applications were now part of the federal legal system, creating an irreversible chain of events that would either vindicate me completely or destroy my family relationships forever. The Patent Office will acknowledge receipt within 24 hours, Michael explained. David will be notified of the challenge to his patents within a week. After that, everything becomes public record. That evening, I sat in my backyard next to, the irrigation system that had started everything, watching the smart sensors adjust water flow based on soil moisture and weather data. The technology worked exactly as I designed it 3 years earlier, efficiently maintaining my garden while using minimal water resources. But now, this simple irrigation system represented much more than a solution to desert gardening challenges. It had become the centerpiece of a federal fraud investigation that would test whether the patent system could protect individual inventors from sophisticated thieves. I thought about calling David to warn him about what was coming, to give him a chance to come clean and try to make things right before federal investigators became involved. But I realized that David had made his choice months ago when he'd decided to claim credit for my work. The legal system would now determine the consequences of that choice. Saturday passed quietly, with no word from the Patent Office and no communication from David. I spent the day cleaning my garage workshop, organizing tools and components I'd used to develop the technology that was now at the center of a federal investigation. Sunday evening brought the first sign that our legal strategy was working. Michael called with news that the patent office had already acknowledged receipt of our submissions and assigned a priority case number to the fraud investigation. Sarah, they're treating this as an expedited review because of the investor fraud. Implications, Michael explained. The patent office investigator told me this is one of the most well-documented fraud cases they've received. Michael also had news about my own patent applications. The patent office had fast-tracked my applications because of the prior art evidence we'd submitted. If David's patents were rejected for fraud, my patents would likely be approved within months rather than the typical multi-year process. You could be holding approved patents for your irrigation technology before the end of the year, Michael said. And once those patents are approved, you'll have legal standing to pursue licensing deals or start your own company. That night, I began researching the business possibilities that would open up once I owned legitimate patents for my technology. Agricultural equipment companies, irrigation system manufacturers, and water conservation organizations all represented potential. Licensing partners who might be interested in technology that could reduce water usage by more than 60%. For the first time since discovering David's betrayal, I began thinking about the future rather than dwelling on the past. My technology could still make a positive impact on water conservation, but now it would happen with proper credit and financial compensation for the inventor who'd actually created it. Monday morning brought the phone call I'd been expecting. David's name appeared on my phone screen at 8:47 a.m., and I could tell from his tone that he'd received notice of the patent challenge. Sarah, what the hell have you done? I just got a letter from the patent office saying my patent applications are being challenged for prior art violations. They're also investigating fraud allegations. Did you file complaints against me? David, I filed documentation proving that I invented the technology you're trying to patent. The patent office is just doing their job by investigating when someone claims to have invented technology that already exists. Sarah, you're going to destroy everything I've built. Martin Tech has employees now, investors who trusted me, contracts with major companies. If my patents get rejected, the whole business collapses. Then you should have thought about that before you decided to steal my work and claim it as your own invention. David's voice became desperate, pleading in a way I'd never heard before. Look, maybe we can work something out. I'll add your name to the patents as a co-inventor. We can restructure the company to give you equity. There has to be a way to fix this without destroying everything. David, you can't add my name to patents as a co-inventor when I'm actually the sole inventor. You can't give me equity in a company that's built on technology you stole from me. The only way to fix this is to tell the truth about who actually invented this technology. Sarah, please. I made mistakes, but I was trying to help both of us succeed. I really believed I could build something great with your technology. You mean you believed you could build something great with my technology while erasing my contribution and claiming all the credit for yourself? The conversation ended with David promising to have his lawyers contact Michael to work out a settlement that would avoid destroying Martin Tech and his reputation in the technology industry. But I knew from my research that patent fraud cases couldn't be settled once federal investigators became involved. David had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the legal system was now in control of his fate. Tuesday brought news that accelerated everything. Michael called with an update from the patent office investigator assigned to David's case. Sarah, they've already suspended David's patent applications pending the fraud investigation. The investigator told me they've never seen prior art documentation this comprehensive. Your engineering notebooks make it impossible for David to claim he developed this technology independently. But the news got even better. The patent office had also fast-tracked the approval process for my own patent applications. Since my prior art documentation was so thorough, they could approve my patents without the usual extensive review process. You could be holding approved patents within 60 days, Michael said. The patent office wants to resolve this case quickly because of the media attention it's likely to generate. Media attention. I hadn't considered that patent fraud cases involving startup companies often attracted journalists interested in stories about deception in the technology industry. Wednesday confirmed Michael's prediction about media coverage. Jake Thompson, the journalist who'd originally written about David's funding round, called me directly. "Sarah, I've been investigating some inconsistencies in David Martinez's background, and I understand you've filed patent challenges that relate to Martintech's technology. Would you be willing to speak on the record about your concerns?" I realized that Jake had connected the dots between his earlier suspicions about David's technical claims and the patent challenges that were now public record. This was my opportunity to tell the true story of who had actually invented the technology David was claiming as his breakthrough innovation. "Jake, I'm willing to discuss the factual timeline of how this irrigation technology was actually developed and who actually developed it." We scheduled an interview for Thursday afternoon. Jake warned me that his article would likely generate significant attention, especially since it would directly contradict the narrative David had been promoting about his role as an innovative, technical entrepreneur. "Sarah, are you prepared for the scrutiny that comes with publicly challenging a startup CEO who's been featured in major publications? This story will likely go viral once it's published." I thought about the 3 years I'd spent working in obscurity while David had enjoyed public recognition for my achievements. I thought about other engineers whose work might be stolen if patent fraud was allowed to succeed without consequences. "Jake, I've been prepared for this scrutiny since the moment I realized my own brother had stolen my life's work and claimed it as his own invention. It's time people knew the truth." Thursday's interview with Jake lasted 2 hours and covered every aspect of the technology development timeline, David's theft of my work, and the patent fraud investigation that was now underway. Jake had done his homework, asking detailed questions that demonstrated he understood both the technical aspects of my invention and the legal implications of David's fraud. "Sarah, I want to make sure I understand this correctly," Jake said near the end of our interview. "You developed this irrigation technology over 3 years, documented every aspect of the development process, and David learned about your work 8 months ago when you trusted him to help with business development." "That's correct. David had no knowledge of irrigation technology, water conservation, or agricultural systems before I showed him my prototype at a family barbecue 8 months ago. And now David has raised over $2 million in investment capital based on patents that claim he invented technology you actually developed years before he knew it existed." "Yes. David's patent applications list him as the sole inventor of technology I created, and he's used those fraudulent patents to raise money from investors who believe they're funding an innovative technical entrepreneur." Jake's article was scheduled to publish Monday morning, giving me the weekend to prepare for the public attention that would follow. Michael advised me to expect calls from other journalists, investigators, and possibly law enforcement officials once the story went viral. "Sarah, this case is about to become much bigger than a simple patent dispute," Michael warned. "You're exposing systematic fraud in the startup investment ecosystem. People are going to want to hear your story." That weekend, I prepared for the media storm that was coming by, organizing my thoughts about why this case mattered beyond my personal situation. Patent fraud undermined the entire innovation system that was supposed to protect inventors and reward genuine technical achievement. If someone like David could steal technology, raise millions in investment capital, and become celebrated as an innovative entrepreneur without facing consequences, it would encourage other thieves to attempt similar frauds. My case needed to demonstrate that the legal system could protect individual inventors from sophisticated intellectual property theft. Sunday evening, I received an unexpected email from Dr. Rebecca Rodriguez, the head of agricultural engineering at Arizona State University. She'd somehow learned about my patent applications and the upcoming article about David's fraud. "Sarah, I've reviewed your patent submissions and I'm impressed by the sophistication of your irrigation technology," Dr. Rodriguez wrote. Would you be interested in discussing opportunities to collaborate with our Water Conservation Research Lab? We're always looking for innovative engineers who understand both the technical and environmental aspects of agricultural water management. The email represented something I hadn't expected: recognition from the academic community for my actual technical achievements rather than the business success David had built on stolen work. Real engineers understood the value of what I'd created, even if the business press had been fooled by David's charismatic presentations. Monday morning arrived with Jake Thompson's article published on the front page of TechCrunch. Phoenix CEO accused of patent fraud by sister who claims he stole her 3-year engineering project. The article included side-by-side photographs of my original prototype and David's supposedly independent invention, detailed timelines showing my development work predating David's involvement, and excerpts from the voice message where David had acknowledged the technology as my invention. But the most damaging evidence was the technical analysis Jake had commissioned from an independent engineering consultant. The consultant had reviewed both my documentation and David's patent applications, concluding that the patents described technology that was technically impossible to develop independently in the time frame claimed by the applicant. Within 2 hours of publication, the article had been shared thousands of times on social media. Our patent fraud began trending on Twitter, with engineers sharing their own stories of stolen credit and invisible contributions. My phone started ringing at 9 a.m. and didn't stop for the rest of the day. Journalists from major publications wanted interviews. Television producers wanted to discuss documentary opportunities. Patent attorneys called to offer assistance with related legal matters. But the most significant call came at 2 p.m. from Agent Maria Santos of the FBI's White-Collar Crime Unit. Ms. Martinez, I'm calling about the patent fraud case involving your brother David Martinez. The Patent Office has referred this matter to federal prosecutors, and we'd like to schedule an interview to discuss your evidence and allegations. The quiet engineer who'd spent 3 years documenting her irrigation system development was about to become a federal witness in a criminal case that would determine whether patent fraud would be allowed to succeed in the modern technology economy. Part 4. The First Validation. Agent Maria Santos arrived at Michael Chen's office on Wednesday morning carrying a thick folder and the kind of serious demeanor that made it clear the FBI was taking David's case very seriously. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the methodical approach of someone who'd spent years investigating complex financial crimes. Ms. Martinez, I've reviewed your documentation and the patent fraud complaint you filed with the Patent Office, Agent Santos began. This is one of the most comprehensive intellectual property theft cases I've encountered. Your engineering notebooks read like a forensic timeline of invention. Michael had prepared me for this interview by explaining that federal investigators would need to establish not just that David had committed fraud, but that he'd done so knowingly and with intent to deceive investors and government agencies. Sarah, they'll want to understand the timeline of events, your relationship with David, and most importantly, whether you can prove David knew he was filing false information with the Patent Office, Michael had explained. Agent Santos asked detailed questions about my technology development process, my relationship with David, and the specific conversations where David had learned about my work. She was particularly interested in the electronic communications we'd exchanged, since those provided time-stamped evidence of David's knowledge and intent. Ms. Martinez, I want to make sure I understand the timeline correctly, Agent Santos said, consulting her notes. You developed this irrigation technology over 3 years, from October 2020 through October 2023. David first learned about your work in March 2024 at a family gathering. He offered to help with business development and patent applications in April 2024. Then he filed patent applications in his name as sole inventor in June 2024. That's correct. David filed patents claiming to have invented technology he'd learned about just 3 months earlier, and which I'd been developing for years before he knew it existed. Agent Santos showed me printed copies of David's patent applications, highlighting specific technical claims that matched my documented test results. She pointed to performance specifications that exactly corresponded to measurements I'd recorded in my engineering notebooks, months before David had known about my work. These patents don't just claim similar technology to what you developed, Agent Santos observed. They claim identical performance characteristics that would be statistically impossible to achieve independently. The agent was also interested in David's public statements about his role in developing the technology. She'd collected articles, interview transcripts, and social media posts where David had described himself as the technical innovator behind breakthrough irrigation systems. Mr. Martinez has made numerous public statements claiming to have spent years developing this technology, Agent Santos noted. But your documentation proves he'd never worked in this field before learning about your invention in March 2024. Agent Santos explained that federal prosecutors were considering multiple charges against David, including patent fraud, wire fraud related to his investor presentations, and making false statements to federal agencies. Each charge carried significant penalties, including potential prison time and substantial fines. The strength of your documentation makes this case unusual, Agent Santos said. Most patent fraud cases involve disputes over who contributed what to collaborative development projects. But your evidence shows Mr. Martinez had no involvement in developing this technology whatsoever. The interview lasted 3 hours, with Agent Santos taking detailed notes about every aspect of my case. She photographed key pages from my engineering notebooks, copied electronic communications between David and me, and recorded my testimony about the technical development process. Ms. Martinez, I need to ask whether you're prepared to testify in federal court if this case goes to trial, Agent Santos said as our interview concluded. Patent fraud prosecutions require technical testimony from the true inventor to establish that the defendant couldn't have developed the claimed technology independently. I thought about testifying against my own brother in federal court, about the family consequences of my decision to pursue legal action. But I also thought about the engineers who might be watching to see whether the legal system would protect inventors from intellectual property theft. Agent Santos, I'm prepared to testify about the technical facts of how this technology was developed and who actually developed it. David made his choice when he decided to commit fraud. I'm just providing evidence about what actually happened. Agent Santos seemed pleased with my response. That's exactly the attitude we need from witnesses in fraud cases. You're not pursuing this case to harm your brother. You're pursuing it to protect the integrity of the patent system and prevent investor fraud. After Agent Santos left, Michael and I discussed the likely timeline for David's prosecution. Federal investigations typically took months to complete, but our case was so well documented that prosecutors might move quickly. Sarah, the FBI agent was impressed by your documentation and your willingness to testify, Michael said. That combination usually leads to successful prosecutions in fraud cases. Michael also had news about my own patent applications. The Patent Office had expedited their review process and would likely approve my patents within weeks rather than months. Once your patents are approved, you'll have legal standing to pursue licensing agreements with agricultural companies, Michael explained. Your technology could generate significant revenue while also advancing water conservation efforts. That afternoon, I received a call from Dr. Rebecca Rodriguez at Arizona State University. She'd read Jake Thompson's article about David's fraud case and wanted to discuss collaboration opportunities for legitimate irrigation research. Sarah, I'm impressed by both your technical innovation and your courage in exposing patent fraud, Dr. Rodriguez said. We're starting a new water conservation technology lab, and we'd love to have someone with your expertise and integrity leading research projects. Dr. Rodriguez explained that the university was seeking partnerships with innovative engineers who could develop practical solutions to Arizona's water challenges. My irrigation technology represented exactly the kind of applied research they wanted to support. Would you be interested in a position as senior research engineer in our new lab? Dr. Rodriguez asked. The position would allow you to continue developing water conservation technology while also mentoring graduate students in practical engineering applications. The offer represented recognition for my actual technical achievements rather than stolen credit for work I'd done in isolation. Academic researchers understood the value of methodical engineering development and comprehensive documentation. Dr. Rodriguez, I'm very interested in discussing this opportunity, I replied. I've always wanted my technology to make a broader impact on water conservation efforts. We scheduled a meeting for the following week to discuss the research, position, and potential collaboration projects. For the first time since discovering David's fraud, I began thinking about positive opportunities rather than legal battles. Thursday brought more validation from an unexpected source. Tom Harrison, the Chief Technology Officer at Aquatech Industries, one of the largest irrigation equipment manufacturers in the Southwest, called to discuss licensing opportunities for my technology. Ms. Martinez, we've been following the news about your patent applications and the fraud case involving your brother, Tom said. Our technical team has reviewed your documentation, and we're impressed by the sophistication of your irrigation algorithms. Tom explained that Aquatech had been searching for advanced irrigation technology that could meet increasingly strict water conservation requirements in drought-prone regions. My system's ability to reduce water usage by more than 60% while maintaining plant health made it extremely valuable for commercial applications. We'd be interested in discussing licensing agreements once your patents are approved. Tom continued, this technology could help our customers meet regulatory requirements while reducing operational costs. The licensing discussion represented something I'd never imagined when I was developing irrigation technology in my garage workshop. My 3 years of methodical engineering work could now generate revenue while helping solve real water conservation challenges across the agricultural industry. Friday afternoon brought the call I'd been waiting for since filing my patent applications. Michael Chen called with news from the patent office. Sarah, your patent applications have been approved. You're now the official patent holder for the Smart Irrigation Controller technology, including all the algorithms and sensor configurations you developed. Michael explained that my patents were unusually comprehensive, covering not just the basic technology, but also the specific innovations that made my system more efficient than competing products. These patents give you strong intellectual property, protection, and excellent licensing potential, Michael said. You now own legitimate legal rights to technology that's already proven its commercial value. The approved patents represented vindication beyond what I'd expected when I first discovered David's fraud. The patent office had not only rejected David's fraudulent applications, but had also recognized me as the true inventor with comprehensive legal protection for my work. That evening, I sat in my backyard next to the irrigation system that had started everything, holding printed copies of my newly approved patents. The technical descriptions were precise and comprehensive, protecting every aspect of the technology I'd developed through 3 years of methodical engineering work. But the patents represented more than legal protection for my intellectual property. They represented validation that the patent system could work correctly when inventors documented their work properly and had the courage to challenge fraud. My case was becoming a symbol for other engineers who'd seen their work stolen, their contributions erased, their innovations claimed by people who understood business better than technology. The quiet engineer who documented everything had proven that technical precision could defeat charismatic fraud when the legal system was presented with clear evidence. Saturday brought news that David's situation was deteriorating rapidly. Jake Thompson called to tell me that Martin Tech's board of directors had placed David on administrative leave pending the outcome of the federal investigation. Sarah, David's investors are panicking, Jake explained. They funded Martin Tech based on intellectual property that doesn't actually belong to the company. Some of them are already talking to lawyers about recovering their investments. Jake, Also told me that other technology journalists were investigating David's claims about his previous work and educational background. They were finding inconsistencies that suggested David's pattern of misrepresentation extended beyond just my irrigation technology. This story has opened up questions about David's entire professional history, Jake said. It looks like claiming credit for your work wasn't his first experience with creative resume writing. Sunday evening brought a call I'd been dreading since filing my patent fraud complaint. My mother's voice was strained and emotional as she tried to understand how her children had ended up in a federal criminal case. "Sarah, your brother says you're trying to destroy his life over some garden sprinkler. He says you filed false complaints because you were jealous of his business success. What's really happening between you two?" I spent an hour explaining the technical timeline, the patent fraud, and the evidence that proved David had stolen my work. My mother listened quietly, occasionally asking questions that showed she was beginning to understand the seriousness of David's actions. "Mija, I don't understand all the technical details, but I know you've always been honest about your work," my mother said finally. "If David took credit for something you created, that's not right, even if he's your brother." The conversation was painful but necessary. My family needed to understand that I hadn't initiated this legal battle out of jealousy or sibling rivalry. I'd simply provided evidence that proved who had actually invented the technology David was claiming as his breakthrough innovation. Monday morning brought confirmation that David's legal troubles were escalating beyond patent fraud. Agent Santos called to inform me that federal prosecutors had decided to file formal charges against David, including wire fraud related to his investor presentations and making false statements to federal agencies. Ms. Martinez, the U.S. Attorney's Office will be announcing the indictment later this week, Agent Santos said. This case will likely receive significant media attention because of the startup investment fraud implications. The federal indictment would make David's case a matter of public record, ensuring that investors, entrepreneurs, and engineers would learn about the consequences of patent fraud in the modern technology economy. The quiet engineer who'd spent 3 years documenting her irrigation system development was about to become a federal witness in a landmark case that would determine whether intellectual property theft could succeed in the startup investment ecosystem. Part 5. The Major Reversal. The phone call that changed everything came at 7:23 a.m. on Tuesday morning. I was getting ready for work when Agent Santos called with news that would turn David's world upside down in a matter of hours. "Ms. Martinez, the federal indictment against your brother has been unsealed. David Martinez is being charged with patent fraud, wire fraud, and making false statements to federal agencies. The charges carry potential penalties of up to 20 years in prison and substantial financial fines." Agent Santos explained that federal prosecutors had moved quickly because of the strength of my documentation and the clear evidence of investor fraud. David's use of stolen intellectual property to raise investment capital had elevated his crimes from simple patent disputes to serious federal felonies. "The indictment will be publicly announced this afternoon," Agent Santos continued. "I wanted to give you advance notice because this case will likely generate significant media coverage." By 10 a.m., news of David's indictment was spreading across technology industry publications. The headlines were devastating. Phoenix startup CEO indicted for patent fraud. Martin Tech founder charged with stealing sister's invention. Federal prosecutors target startup investment fraud. Jake Thompson's follow-up article provided comprehensive coverage of the federal charges, including detailed explanations of how David had used my stolen technology to deceive investors and government agencies. The article included quotes from patent law experts who described my case as a textbook example of intellectual property theft. But the most significant coverage came from TechCrunch's analysis of how David's fraud had been exposed by his sister's meticulous documentation. The article highlighted my engineering notebooks as evidence that individual inventors could protect themselves from sophisticated thieves through proper record-keeping. Sarah Martinez's 3 years of detailed engineering documentation made this patent fraud case unusually easy to prosecute, the article noted. Her case demonstrates the importance of thorough technical documentation for inventors working independently. By noon, Martin-Tech's website had been taken offline, and the company's social media accounts had been deactivated. David's professional LinkedIn profile, which had described him as a technology entrepreneur with deep expertise in water conservation, was no longer accessible. The most dramatic development came at 2 p.m. when Martin-Tech's board of directors issued a public statement announcing David's immediate termination as CEO and the suspension of all company operations pending resolution of the federal criminal case. The board of directors has learned of serious allegations regarding the intellectual property foundations of Martin-Tech's technology, the statement read. Until these matters are resolved through the legal system, the company cannot continue operations based on potentially fraudulent patents. Michael Chen called that afternoon with news about the civil implications of David's criminal indictment. Martin-Tech's investors were already filing lawsuits to recover their investments, claiming they'd been defrauded by David's misrepresentations about his role in developing the company's technology. Sarah, David's investors lost over $2 million based on his fraudulent claims, Michael explained. They're now seeking damages not just from David personally, but from anyone who benefited from the fraudulent investment scheme. Michael also explained that my newly approved patents gave me legal standing to pursue my own civil claims against David and Martin-Tech for damages related to the unauthorized use of my intellectual property. You could potentially recover financial damages for the commercial value of your stolen technology, Michael said. David used your invention to generate millions in investment capital that rightfully belonged to you as the actual inventor. But the most significant call of the day came from Dr. Rebecca Rodriguez at Arizona State University. She'd been following the news coverage of David's indictment and wanted to accelerate our discussions about the research position she'd offered. Sarah, your case has generated tremendous respect in the academic engineering community, Dr. Rodriguez said. You've demonstrated both technical excellence and professional integrity under extremely difficult circumstances. Dr. Rodriguez explained that the university's Board of Regents had approved immediate funding for the new Water Conservation Technology Lab, with me as the founding senior research engineer. The position would allow me to continue developing irrigation technology while also leading graduate student research projects. We're prepared to offer you a position that includes patent licensing support, graduate student research teams, and collaboration opportunities with agricultural companies throughout the Southwest, Dr. Rodriguez said. The university position represented recognition for my actual technical achievements rather than the stolen credit David had claimed. Academic institutions understood the value of methodical engineering development and comprehensive documentation that had made my patent fraud case so compelling. Wednesday brought news that David's legal situation was deteriorating rapidly. His criminal defense attorney had contacted federal prosecutors to discuss plea bargain possibilities, suggesting that David's legal team understood the strength of the evidence against him. Michael Chen received a call from David's attorney, requesting copies of my technical documentation, ostensibly to help David understand the scope of his legal exposure. But Michael recognized the request as preparation for plea negotiations rather than trial preparation. Sarah, David's attorney, is trying to assess whether there's any possibility of challenging your evidence at trial, Michael explained. The fact that they're requesting documentation suggests they're preparing to negotiate a guilty plea rather than fight the charges. Michael advised me to expect contact from David or his representatives seeking some kind of settlement that would reduce his criminal exposure. Patent fraud cases sometimes resulted in plea agreements that included restitution payments to the actual inventors whose work had been stolen. But remember that criminal charges can't be settled or dismissed based on civil agreements, Michael Sawi warned. Even if David tries to make financial arrangements with you, he'll still face federal prosecution for the crimes he committed. Thursday afternoon brought the call I'd been expecting since David's indictment was announced. David's voice was different than I'd ever heard it before, defeated, desperate, and stripped of the confident charisma that had characterized his entire adult personality. "Sarah, my lawyer says I need to talk to you about resolving this situation before it destroys both our lives." "David, you destroyed our relationship when you decided to steal my work and claim it as your own invention. The legal system is just determining the consequences of that choice." "Look, I know I made mistakes, but I never intended for things to go this far. I thought I was helping both of us by building a business around your technology." "You thought? You were helping me by erasing my contribution and claiming all the credit for yourself?" David's voice became pleading, desperate in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Sarah, the prosecutors are talking about 20 years in prison. My life is over unless we can work something out. I'll give you credit for the technology. I'll pay you whatever licensing fees you want. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." "David, you can't give me credit for technology I already invented. You can't pay licensing fees for intellectual property you stole. The only way to make this right is to tell the truth about who actually developed this technology." "I'll testify that you were the real inventor," David offered desperately. "I'll admit publicly that I made mistakes in the patent applications. We can fix this without destroying my entire future." "David, you didn't make mistakes in patent applications. You committed federal crimes by knowingly filing false information with government agencies and using stolen intellectual property to defraud investors." The conversation ended with David promising to have his attorney contact Michael about potential restitution arrangements. But I knew from my research that federal criminal cases proceeded independently of any civil settlements between the parties. David had crossed legal lines that couldn't be uncrossed through family negotiations or financial arrangements. The federal government was now prosecuting him for crimes against the patent system and the investment community, not just for wrongs against me personally. Friday brought validation from the most unexpected source: David's former investors. Tom Bradley, the venture capitalist who'd led Martintech's funding round, called to apologize for not conducting more thorough due diligence on David's technical claims. "Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that our firm has learned valuable lessons from this case about verifying founder credentials and intellectual property claims," Tom said. "Your documentation standards should be a model for other inventors seeking to protect their work." Tom also mentioned that several venture capital firms were now requiring enhanced intellectual property verification procedures for startup investments, partly in response to the publicity surrounding David's fraud case. "Your case has changed how our industry approaches technical due diligence," Tom continued. "We're now requiring inventors to provide the kind of comprehensive documentation you maintained throughout your development process." The conversation represented recognition from the investment community that my case had exposed systematic weaknesses in how startup funding decisions were made. Venture capitalists were learning that charismatic presentations couldn't substitute for genuine technical innovation and proper intellectual property documentation. That weekend, I received dozens of messages from engineers around the country who'd been inspired by my decision to challenge patent fraud through proper documentation and legal action. Many shared their own stories of stolen credit, invisible contributions, and technical achievements that had been claimed by more charismatic colleagues. But the most meaningful message came from Dr. Elena Vasquez, a mechanical engineering professor at Stanford University who'd been following my case through academic publications. "Sarah, your case represents a watershed moment for individual inventors and engineering professionals," Dr. Vasquez wrote. "You've demonstrated that technical excellence and proper documentation can defeat sophisticated fraud, even when the perpetrator has significant business advantages." Dr. Vasquez invited me to speak at the next American Society of Mechanical Engineers conference about intellectual property protection for individual inventors. My case was being recognized as a landmark example of how engineers could protect their work from theft and fraud. Sunday evening, I sat in my backyard next to the irrigation system that had started everything, reading news coverage of David's case. and the broader impact it was having on technology industry practices. My 3 years of methodical engineering development had become the foundation for changes in how investors, patent offices, and engineering communities approached intellectual property protection. The quiet engineer who documented every aspect of her innovation process had accidentally become a symbol for other inventors whose work had been stolen or marginalized. My case was proving that technical precision and legal preparation could defeat charismatic fraud when the evidence was properly organized and courageously presented. David's phone call Monday morning would be our last conversation as siblings. His voice carried a weight I'd never heard before, the sound of someone who'd finally grasped the full consequences of his actions. The federal prosecutors had made their position clear. They were seeking the maximum penalties allowable under law for patent fraud, wire fraud, and making false statements to federal agencies. Sarah, my attorney says the government won't consider any plea deals that don't include significant prison time, David said, his voice hollow. They're treating this as a landmark case to send a message about startup fraud. Everything I built is gone, and now they want to make an example of me. I felt no satisfaction in hearing the defeat in my brother's voice. This had never been about revenge or punishment. It had been about reclaiming credit for my own work and preventing other inventors from suffering the same betrayal I'd experienced. David, the prosecutors aren't punishing you because they want to make an example. They're prosecuting you because you committed serious federal crimes. You used stolen intellectual property to defraud investors and government agencies. I know that now, David replied quietly. My lawyer showed me all the evidence you provided. Those engineering notebooks, the photographs, the timeline of development. I never realized how thoroughly you documented everything. I thought I could make the patent applications work because I didn't understand how detailed your records were. For a moment, David sounded like the brother I'd grown up with, rather than the fraud he'd become. But that moment passed quickly, as he returned to the desperate bargaining that had characterized all our recent conversations. Sarah, there has to be something we can do. Some way to resolve this that doesn't destroy our entire family. Mom hasn't stopped crying since the indictment was announced. She keeps asking how her children ended up in federal court against each other. David, you made that choice when you decided to steal my work. I didn't put us in federal court. I just provided evidence about who actually invented the technology you claimed as your own. Our conversation ended with David acknowledging, for the first time, that I had been the sole inventor of the irrigation technology that had briefly made him wealthy and famous. It was an admission that came too late to save him from criminal prosecution, but it provided the closure I needed to move forward with my life. Tuesday brought news that marked the end of David's business career and the beginning of my new professional chapter. The U.S. Attorney's Office announced that David had accepted a plea agreement that included 3 years in federal prison, substantial financial restitution to defrauded investors, and a permanent ban from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company. The plea agreement also required David to provide public testimony, acknowledging that he had fraudulently claimed credit for technology invented by his sister. This testimony would become part of the court record, ensuring that the true story of my invention would be permanently documented in federal legal proceedings. Michael Chen called that afternoon with details of the plea agreement and its implications for my civil claims against David and the defunct Martintech Corporation. Sarah, David's plea agreement includes restitution payments that recognize you as the true inventor of the technology he stole, Michael explained. You'll receive financial compensation for the unauthorized commercial use of your intellectual property, plus damages for the harm caused by David's fraud. The financial settlement was substantial, reflecting not just the licensing value of my technology, but also punitive damages for the sophisticated nature of David's fraud. Combined with the licensing opportunities now available through my legitimate patents, the settlement would provide financial security while I pursued new research opportunities. But more important than the financial compensation was the legal precedent my case had established. Patent attorneys across the country were citing my documentation methods as the gold standard for protecting intellectual property rights. Engineering. Schools were incorporating my case into their curricula as an example of proper invention documentation and professional ethics. Wednesday marked my first day as senior research engineer at Arizona State University's newly established Water Conservation Technology Lab. Dr. Rebecca Rodriguez had assembled an impressive team of graduate students and faculty researchers who were eager to build upon the irrigation technology I'd developed independently. Walking into my new laboratory, surrounded by advanced equipment and enthusiastic young engineers, I felt a sense of professional validation that had been missing throughout my ordeal with David. These researchers respected my technical achievements and understood the methodical approach that had made my breakthrough innovations possible. Sarah, we've been following your case not just for the legal precedent, but for the quality of your engineering work, said Dr. Jennifer Liu, a faculty member specializing in agricultural water management. The efficiency improvements you achieved represent the kind of practical innovation our field desperately needs. My first research project at ASU involved scaling up my irrigation algorithms for commercial agricultural applications. The university had already secured partnerships with major farming operations throughout Arizona and California, all eager to implement technology that could reduce water usage while maintaining crop yields. But the research lab represented more than just an opportunity to continue my technical work. It provided a platform to mentor other engineers, particularly women, who were developing innovations that could be vulnerable to theft or appropriation by more senior colleagues. Thursday brought a visit from Agent Maria Santos, who wanted to discuss the broader impact my case was having on federal law enforcement approaches to intellectual property crimes. The FBI was using my documentation methods as a training example for other investigators handling patent fraud cases. Ms. Martinez, your case has changed how we approach intellectual property investigations, Agent Santos explained. Your engineering notebooks provided the kind of clear timeline evidence that made prosecution straightforward. We're now advising other inventors to maintain similar documentation standards. Agent Santos also informed me that my case had contributed to new federal guidelines for investigating startup investment fraud. The FBI was working with the Securities and Exchange Commission to develop enhanced procedures for verifying intellectual property claims made by companies seeking investment capital. Your brother's case exposed systematic weaknesses in how the investment community evaluates technical claims, Agent Santos said. Federal agencies are now coordinating more effectively to prevent similar frauds from succeeding. Friday afternoon brought the call I'd been anticipating since my patents were approved. Tom Harrison from Aquatech Industries contacted me to finalize licensing agreements for my irrigation technology. The company had conducted extensive testing and determined that my system could reduce water usage by up to 70% in commercial applications. Sarah, we've never seen irrigation technology that combines this level of efficiency with practical reliability, Tom said. Our field tests show performance improvements beyond what your original documentation promised. The licensing agreement with Aquatech was structured to provide ongoing royalty payments, while allowing me to continue developing enhanced versions of the technology through my research position at ASU. Other agricultural companies were already requesting similar licensing arrangements, suggesting that my technology could generate substantial revenue while advancing water conservation efforts across the industry. But the most gratifying aspect of the licensing discussions was the recognition from industry professionals who understood the technical complexity of what I'd achieved. These engineers and executives appreciated the methodical development process that had produced breakthrough innovations rather than the superficial business presentations that had initially fooled investors. The weekend brought reflection on how dramatically my life had changed in the months since discovering David's fraud. I'd gone from an unknown engineer working in isolation to a recognized innovator with approved patents, academic recognition, and commercial success. But the transformation had come at the cost of permanently destroying my relationship with my brother and creating lasting divisions within my family. My mother called Saturday evening to discuss the family implications of David's imprisonment and my decision to pursue federal prosecution. She'd spent months trying to understand how her children had ended up on opposite sides of a criminal case, and she was beginning to accept that David's actions had made legal conflict inevitable. Misha, I still don't understand all the technical details, but I know you've always been honest about your work, my mother said. If David took credit for something you created, then you were right to fight for what belonged to you. The conversation with my mother was painful, but necessary. She needed to understand that I hadn't initiated this legal battle out of sibling rivalry or professional jealousy. I'd simply provided evidence that proved who had actually invented the technology David had claimed as his breakthrough innovation. Mom, I never wanted David to go to prison, I explained. I just wanted credit for my own work. David chose to commit federal crimes rather than acknowledge that I was the actual inventor. Monday brought news that demonstrated the lasting impact my case was having on intellectual property protection and engineering education. The American Society of Mechanical Engineers announced that they were establishing the Sarah Martinez Award for Engineering Documentation Excellence, recognizing inventors who maintained comprehensive records of their development work. Dr. Elena Vasquez from Stanford called to explain the significance of the award and its connection to my case. Sarah, your documentation standards have become a model for engineering professionals across multiple disciplines. This award will encourage other inventors to protect their work through proper record keeping. The Engineering Society Award represented recognition from my professional peers that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of David's fraud case. My methodical approach to invention documentation was being celebrated as a best practice that all engineers should emulate. Tuesday marked the 6-month anniversary of filing my initial patent challenge, and Michael Chen called to review how completely my legal position had been vindicated. David's criminal conviction had validated every aspect of my intellectual property claims, while my approved patents provided comprehensive protection for future commercial applications of my technology. Sarah, your case represents one of the most successful intellectual property recoveries I've handled in 23 years of practice, Michael said. You not only reclaimed credit for your own work, but established legal precedents that will protect other inventors from similar fraud. Michael also informed me that several law schools were incorporating my case into their intellectual property courses as an example of how proper documentation and courageous legal action could defeat sophisticated fraud. Legal scholars were analyzing my case as a watershed moment in patent law enforcement. Wednesday brought confirmation that my research work at ASU was already generating new innovations that could have even broader impact than my original irrigation technology. Working with graduate student researchers, I'd developed enhanced algorithms that could optimize water usage for entire agricultural regions rather than individual farms or gardens. The regional optimization technology represented a natural evolution of my original innovation, but it required the collaborative research environment and advanced computing resources that were only available through my university position. Individual inventors working in isolation, no matter how dedicated, couldn't achieve the scale of impact that was possible through institutional support. My graduate student research team included several women engineers who'd been inspired by my case to pursue careers in water conservation technology. These young researchers understood that technical excellence and professional integrity were more valuable than charismatic presentation skills or business development abilities. Professor Martinez, your case taught us that engineering documentation isn't just about protecting intellectual property, said Maria Santos, one of my doctoral students. It's about maintaining professional standards and ensuring that credit goes to the people who actually do the technical work. Thursday afternoon brought a visitor I hadn't expected. Jake Thompson, the journalist whose original article about David's funding round had inadvertently helped expose the fraud. Jake was working on a follow-up story about the long-term impact of my case on the technology industry and academic engineering community. Sarah, Your case has changed how technology journalists approach coverage of startup companies and founder credentials, Jake explained. We're now much more careful about verifying technical claims and investigating the backgrounds of entrepreneurs who claim to have developed breakthrough innovations. Jake's investigation had revealed that David's fraud wasn't an isolated incident. Several other startup companies had been founded on questionable intellectual property claims, and technology journalists were now conducting more rigorous fact-checking of founder backgrounds and patent applications. Your case exposed systematic problems in how the technology industry evaluates innovation claims, Jake said. Investors, journalists, and government agencies are all implementing enhanced verification procedures, partly in response to what happened with David and Martin Tech. Friday brought the final resolution of all legal matters related to David's fraud case. The federal judge overseeing David's sentencing praised my cooperation with investigators and my professionalism throughout the legal proceedings. Ms. Martinez represents the best aspects of American innovation and engineering excellence, the judge stated during David's sentencing hearing. Her meticulous documentation and willingness to defend her intellectual property rights serve as an example for other inventors who may face similar challenges. David's sentencing hearing was the last time I saw my brother before he began serving his federal prison term. He looked older, defeated, stripped of the confident charisma that had characterized his entire adult personality. During his allocution to the court, David acknowledged that he had stolen technology from his sister and used it to defraud investors and government agencies. I want to acknowledge that my sister Sarah Martinez was the true inventor of the irrigation technology I claimed as my own, David said, reading from a prepared statement. She spent 3 years developing breakthrough innovations that I stole and fraudulently patented in my own name. I deeply regret the harm I caused to Sarah, to the investors who trusted me, and to the integrity of the patent system. David's public acknowledgement provided the closure I needed to move forward without lingering resentment or regret. He had finally told the truth about who had actually invented the technology that had briefly made him wealthy and famous. The months following David's sentencing brought a series of professional opportunities that demonstrated how completely my reputation had been rehabilitated and enhanced through the legal proceedings. Academic institutions, technology companies, and government agencies recognized me as both a technical innovator and a principled professional who defended intellectual property rights under difficult circumstances. The University of California system offered me a joint appointment to lead water conservation research across multiple campuses. The National Science Foundation invited me to serve on grant review panels for agricultural technology applications. The Patent and Trademark Office asked me to participate in policy discussions about preventing intellectual property fraud. But the most meaningful recognition came from other engineers who'd been inspired by my case to document their own work more carefully and challenge instances of stolen credit they'd previously accepted as inevitable aspects of professional life. Dr. Jennifer Park, a software engineer from Seattle, wrote to tell me that my case had given her the courage to challenge her supervisor's appropriation of algorithms she'd developed for autonomous vehicle navigation. Your documentation methods helped me prove that I was the actual inventor of technology my boss was trying to patent under his own name. Similar messages arrived weekly from engineers across multiple disciplines who'd used my documentation techniques to protect their own intellectual property or challenge fraudulent claims by colleagues and supervisors. My case had become a catalyst for broader changes in how engineering professionals approached innovation documentation and credit attribution. The irrigation technology that had started everything continued generating innovation and impact through my research work at ASU. We'd developed enhanced systems that were being implemented across agricultural operations throughout the Southwest, collectively saving millions of gallons of water annually while maintaining crop yields and reducing operational costs. Commercial licensing agreements were providing ongoing revenue that supported expanded research into water conservation applications for urban landscaping, golf course management, and residential gardening. My original garage workshop innovations had evolved into a comprehensive technology platform that was making measurable contributions to regional water conservation efforts. But beyond the technical and commercial success, my case had established legal and professional precedents that would protect other inventors from the kind of sophisticated theft David had attempted. Patent attorneys regularly cited my documentation methods in client consultations. Engineering schools incorporated my case into professional ethics courses. Government agencies referenced my experience when developing policies to prevent intellectual property fraud. The quiet engineer who'd spent 3 years documenting her irrigation system development had accidentally become a symbol for individual inventors whose contributions were threatened by more charismatic colleagues with better business connections. My case proved that technical excellence and legal preparation could defeat sophisticated fraud when the evidence was properly organized and courageously presented. 2 years after David's sentencing, I received a letter from him in federal prison. He'd been participating in educational programs and claimed to have developed genuine remorse for the harm he'd caused to me, to defrauded investors, and to the integrity of innovation systems he'd undermined through his fraud. Sarah, I know I can never undo the damage I caused, but I want you to know that I understand now what I stole from you wasn't just technology or money, David wrote. I stole credit for years of your dedication and brilliance, and I tried to erase your contribution to something that could make a real difference in the world. David's letter included acknowledgement that my decision to pursue legal action had been necessary and appropriate. He'd finally accepted that his crimes had consequences that extended far beyond our family relationships, and that those consequences were the result of choices he'd made, rather than actions I'd taken. I'm glad you fought back and reclaimed what belonged to you, David continued. I'm proud that my sister is the kind of person who stands up for what's right, even when it's difficult and painful. I chose not to respond to David's letter, but I felt a sense of closure knowing that he'd finally accepted responsibility for his actions and their consequences. Our relationship as siblings had been permanently damaged by his fraud, but at least he'd come to understand the seriousness of what he'd done and the necessity of my response. Today, 5 years after discovering David's betrayal, I lead one of the most respected water conservation research programs in the country. My team at ASU has developed irrigation technologies that are being implemented globally, from California agricultural operations to urban gardens in water-scarce regions of Africa and the Middle East. The patents I fought to reclaim have generated millions in licensing revenue that supports expanded research into sustainable water management. More importantly, the technologies derived from my original garage workshop innovations are helping address water scarcity challenges that affect billions of people worldwide. But the lasting impact of my case extends beyond water conservation technology. Engineering schools across the country teach courses on innovation documentation using my methods as the standard. Patent attorneys advise clients to maintain the kind of comprehensive records that made my fraud case successful. Government agencies have implemented enhanced verification procedures that make intellectual property theft more difficult to accomplish and easier to prosecute. The American Society of Mechanical Engineers now presents the Sarah Martinez Award annually to inventors who exemplify excellence in engineering documentation and professional integrity. Recipients include engineers who've challenged stolen credit, exposed fraudulent patents, and maintained comprehensive records that protect their intellectual property rights. My case has become a landmark example of how individual inventors can protect themselves from sophisticated theft through proper documentation and courageous legal action. But more importantly, it's demonstrated that technical excellence and professional integrity can triumph over charismatic fraud when the evidence is properly presented and the stakes are clearly understood. The engineering notebooks I maintained during 3 years of methodical development work didn't just protect my intellectual property rights. They became the foundation for legal precedents that will protect other inventors from the kind of betrayal I experienced with David. Sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones that generate headlines or immediate recognition. Sometimes, they're the quiet triumphs that establish principles and precedents that protect other people from suffering similar injustices. My irrigation system still operates in my backyard in Phoenix, efficiently maintaining my garden while using minimal water resources. But now it represents much more than a solution to desert gardening challenges. It symbolizes the power of methodical engineering work, comprehensive documentation, and the courage to defend intellectual property rights against sophisticated fraud. The technology that started as a simple solution to keep plants alive in the Arizona desert became the centerpiece of a federal fraud case that changed how inventors protect their work, how investors verify technical claims, and how government agencies prevent intellectual property theft. David served his full 3-year sentence and was released to a halfway house program that will help him reintegrate into society. I hope he's learned from his experience and will find legitimate ways to contribute to technology and innovation without stealing credit from other people's work. As for me, I've learned that being underestimated by charismatic people isn't necessarily a disadvantage. Sometimes the quiet engineer who documents everything and keeps detailed records has advantages that business school graduates and smooth-talking entrepreneurs can't imagine. The patent system isn't perfect, but it can work correctly when inventors protect themselves through proper documentation and have the courage to challenge fraud through legal channels. My case proved that individual inventors can defeat sophisticated thieves when they maintain comprehensive records and refuse to accept stolen credit as an inevitable aspect of professional life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.